Though Vin Diesel has become most well known for his role in the Fast and Furious franchise as the family-centric Domenic Toretto, my first exposure to the actor came in 2000 sci-fi horror extravaganza, Pitch Black. Directed by David Twohy, this unexpectedly memorable film still largely holds up today despite retaining much of that unforgettable early 2000s flavor. The weird zooms and effects accompanied by the clearly outdated CGI give it an unmistakable and unique charm, and the visuals in the film still stick with me years later, particularly those around Riddick's unique eyesight. But these qualities aren't what made me make this video. No, despite how fondly I can reminisce on the first film, which I think heavily outshines the following two, the Riddick trilogy is certainly not the best cinema has to offer. It's a bit too goofy at times and overly shallow for my taste, often avoiding the most emotionally compelling storylines. For instance, I think that the Chronicles of Riddick missed an opportunity with how it handled Jack and Imam, two characters that had an interesting relationship with Riddick and whom I would have liked to see a lot more of in the remaining films, especially after what we see in Dark Fury. However, rewatching the series recently, what I found most interesting, what I couldn't help but notice, was how much the second film shifted from the first film. Pitch Black, a clear horror movie, is followed by the Chronicles of Riddick, an epic sci-fi adventure, and Dark Fury, an animated film. I just don't understand how this happened. How did we go from Pitch Black to the Chronicles of Riddick in Dark Fury? I mean, Pitch Black feels like such a contained story and has such a different feel to it than its sequel. It centered more around an overarching problem, the aliens overwhelming the planet, and how the characters will solve it. It's much less focused on Riddick himself, with him sharing much of the lead with Carolyn Fry. Though he's the most interesting character in the film, mostly through his mysteriousness, it's not so much his story. It's hers. She's the heart of the film, with her actions and inactions standing as the emotional core. At the beginning of the film, in an effort to save herself, she almost releases the passengers on the ship when they are hurling towards the planet, and the guilt that she feels as a result of that near decision creates an emotional condition that she tries to overcome throughout the film, repeatedly putting her own life in danger to protect the people she almost killed. Pitch Black does a much better job of coalescing the characters into the situation and developing them within it than the other films do. Now, that's not to say that I don't enjoy the Chronicles of Riddick though. While I think it gets pretty messy in the way it does so, I enjoy that it really opens up the universe in which these characters live. If you had only seen Pitch Black, watching the Chronicles of Riddick may seem jarring and strange, like you're watching an entirely different franchise, but certain aspects of the film keep reminding you that it is, indeed, connected to the first one. The film opens up in a completely new environment, with nothing connecting us to Pitch Black. We see a fleet of large, gray ships with unfamiliar faces covering them. The narration that accompanies them reveals the threat present to the film, and as we see explosions ripple across the planet, it is immediately clear the difference between this film and the first one. We're not just fighting our way through a group of alien creatures, we're in for something far more massive. The Chronicles of Riddick expanded the world so much, establishing the universe as more than just future humans confined in a sci-fi context. It showed that it also possesses magic and wars and alliances, introducing new races and revealing more of Riddick's backstory and giving him more emotional weight than the first film. Dark Fury bridges the gap between Pitch Black and the Chronicles of Riddick, but although I certainly enjoyed the film, it left me wishing that they had approached the Chronicles of Riddick much differently. So, Dark Fury starts off immediately after the events of Pitch Black, with Riddick, Jack, and Imam on the ship they used to escape the planet. They quickly get picked up by a crew of mercenaries and we learn even more about Riddick and his people. We see his killing prowess taken to new levels and the relationships between the three leads grow even further. And this is where I think they lost out on so much potential in the following films. Yes, Riddick is the main character of the series. It's his story, but that doesn't mean the other characters don't have importance in the story as well. To me, so much of what makes Dark Fury work are the relationships. Seeing how Riddick's views clash with Imam's and how Jack looks up to Riddick and how Imam looks out for Jack is the most interesting part of the film for me. We learn more about the characters and about what they believe and how these beliefs affect their actions and relationships with the other characters. It made me want to see how these relationships developed over time instead of just a day or so. At the end of Dark Fury, Riddick and the crew embark for New Mecca, and we have little reason to believe that they saw any more significant detours after this point. So when we move on to the Chronicles of Riddick, we learn that soon after Riddick took Jack and Imam to New Mecca, he left them, insinuating that there weren't more adventures with the three of them. Their relationships didn't develop much further than what we saw in Dark Fury. Instead, Riddick simply stayed away from them for 5 years. He later says that he did so to keep the mercenaries away from Jack, but I think that there would have been far more emotional weight if they had stayed together for longer so their connection to one another were deeper.
I had mercs on my neck. I'll always have mercs on my neck. I spent 5 years under frozen heat just to keep him away from you.
In the Chronicles of Riddick, when we finally see Jack, who now goes by Kira,
the name's Kira now.
It should be more heartbreaking or surprising or meaningful to see her reunited with Riddick again, to see someone she viewed as an older brother, and to see that she has become what both Riddick and Imam tried to prevent in Dark Fury. Instead, it falls flat to me because they didn't build those relationships enough. We didn't see Riddick abandon them, we only heard about it. We didn't see much of Riddick's influence on Jack, we mostly saw the repercussions of it. The series hinted at these ideas, insinuating that Riddick had an emotional connection with them, that he did care for them, especially Jack. And we see how that connection caused him to abandon them. He says he wanted to protect them from the mercenaries, but it feels more that he just couldn't handle the growing connection and would rather just quit as a result of the hard life he had lived up to that point that made him seem cold, detached, and ruthless, establishing Riddick as more than just a killer, but someone who does have a capacity for emotion, despite the psychopathic image he presents. So, Pitch Black and Dark Fury do a great job of establishing interesting relationships, but the Chronicles of Riddick just doesn't capitalize on these foundations well. Perhaps most critically, with how much I wanted to see this relationship develop, I think they killed off Kira far too early, but since they decided to kill her, they could have done so with more impact. When Kira dies, it should feel devastating. It should have felt like Riddick lost a piece of himself, but it doesn't because we just didn't see enough of their relationship. Now, all of this isn't to say that I hated the Chronicles of Riddick. I enjoyed that it was a sharp contrast to the previous film. It focused far more heavily on action instead of horror. It expanded Riddick's backstory and eyes. It opened up the universe and introduced new elements that we never would have guessed existed from Pitch Black alone. And that's what's so interesting about this series. For many, it's just a throwaway franchise that you may watch once or twice and forget about forever. But for me, I just can't help but be amazed with what they decided to do after the first film. How many movie series have such a drastic shift in subject matter from one film to the next? It's rare to see a sequel so different from its predecessor in so many ways. I just think that they could have had much stronger characters and a more impactful story if they had built on the relationships established in the previous films, especially if they had done so alongside much of the story we end up seeing in the Chronicles of Riddick. Now, when we move on to Riddick, the most recent installment in the series, I'm less sure of how to feel. As the title suggests, it's far more focused on Riddick. We see even more of his tenacity and resilience, his ability to live through even the most hostile situations. We see him struggle to survive on this harsh, unforgiving planet, fighting every second just for his next breath. And this is all great, but we already know that Riddick is badass. Sure, we now see it in a more natural setting as opposed to the futuristic sci-fi environments of the previous films, but what Riddick goes through in the first half of Riddick isn't some new direction for the character. Rather than exploring how he responds to his new position as the Lord Commander of the Necromongers, the writers decide to abandon that in favor of a more in-depth look at what we've already seen from Riddick, showcasing his incredible will and survival instinct. Jigsaw would be proud. Again, all this isn't to say that I didn't enjoy the film at all. Of course, it was pretty fun to watch Riddick fight his way through these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, struggling more than we had ever seen him in the previous films. Later in the movie, we also get a bit more connection to the first film, as we are introduced to Johns' father.
It's not too big a job for you, is it?
But at this point, so far removed from Pitch Black, it simply feels too distant and unimportant. Riddick just ends up feeling like a detour in a larger story that could have been skipped. Sure, we see some new creatures and settings, but the film simply doesn't offer much that feels necessary to see or learn with regards to the world or the characters. After watching Riddick, I'm even more sure that the franchise would have been much better if we saw another film set between Dark Fury and the Chronicles of Riddick, where Riddick, Jack, and Imam's relationships are developed more, and then, at the end of that movie, Riddick takes them to New Mecca and leaves them. That way, we'd have had a much better understanding of the relationships between these characters, so if or when they eventually died, it would have held far more weight. As it stands, we just didn't have enough time to get emotionally invested in these characters, especially Imam, whose relationship with Riddick had so much potential from what we saw in the first film. Their disagreements on how they viewed God in the first film was interesting to see, but we only got a glimpse of it in the following films. And Riddick's relationship with Jack should have been the heart of the series, or at least had more importance in the first few films than what it ended up having. Now, despite all of my critiques about this series, I still find it compelling. I think Riddick is a fun character, someone who seems far more inhuman and psychopathic at first glance than he actually is, and the exploration of that in relation to other characters still has so much potential. So I'm interested in seeing what the next film brings. Apparently, it'll explore Riddick's homeworld, Furia, which reminds me of a question I had. Why did the purifier from the Chronicles of Riddick not have eyes like Riddick's? I initially thought that pitch black implied that Riddick got his eyes in an operation,
Gotta kill a few people.
but in the Chronicles of Riddick, Kira seems to have done what Riddick said to do years earlier but never actually got those same eyes, which makes me think that he was simply joking or lying about the origin of his eyes in the first film, and in the most recent film, Vaco says that he had been to Furia and saw other people with eyes like Riddick's, which implies that Riddick's eyes are a genetic trait for Furians, but the purifier from the Chronicles of Riddick did not have those same eyes. Why? Were they not inherent to all Furians? Were they removed somehow? I don't know. I'd be interested in seeing more about that in the next film. And with all that said, again, I really do enjoy the Riddick series, and I'm really interested in seeing what they do in the next film. Thanks for watching.
Did you not listen?